And I welcome everyone to Press TV's news review program where we get in depth in one of the day's top stories. The UN humanitarian chief has sounded the alarm about Israel's war on Gaza spreading to Lebanon. Martin Griffiths warned the regime's war with Hezbollah resistance movement will be potentially apocalyptic. He said Israel's war on Lebanon will draw in other countries and could lead to more tragedy and death. The European Union's foreign policy chief also called for immediate de-escalation, adding the region cannot afford another war. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock expressed her concerns over the latest escalations in southern Lebanon, calling for extreme restraint on both sides. She said any miscalculation could trigger a hot war. Earlier, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan had warned Israel's plans to spread the Gaza war could result in a great disaster in the region. He urged Muslim nations to stand up to Western powers that are supporting Israel. Joining us now for the program is Yves Zangler, author and political activist, joining us from Montreal, and Tony Gosling, historian and investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program. Hope you're both doing well. I guess we could start there in we'll do it alphabetically. Bristol with you, Tony. Your thoughts about this thing erupting? And it's funny. Some of the most concerned are Berlin and Washington, and they count for what, about 24% and 70% of the arms that are supplied to Tel Aviv, respectively. Pardon. Your initial thoughts on this what a possible escalation into Lebanon would be?
Well, it's interesting you said, but did you just say Berlin and Washington?
Yeah.
Yeah, because isn't this déjà vu, Second World War? After World War II, many people have studied, in fact, there's been some very good books written about this, not a lot of publicity, but Operation Paperclip was where the Nazi war criminals were transported over to the United States at the end of the Second World War because they were needed, the Americans believed, in order to fight the Cold War, which was coming. But isn't it strange how the United States now, 80 years after, is behaving rather like Nazi Germany? In other words, it thinks it can dominate and invade whichever country it wants. Back in 1939 and 1940, the Nazis were doing that in Europe. What's happening right now is the United States seems to be doing it all over the globe, where they're not faced down by very powerful opponents. So anywhere the opponents are weak, like in South America, Africa, etc., and if we see in the Middle East, the United States has got together with its poison child Israel, and they're doing a similar kind of thing. So we've got the whole of law and order is breaking down. I just want to point out that this is all very much published, public knowledge, their plans, what they intend to do. In 1982, we had the Yinon Plan published, which was an Israeli plan to balkanize the Middle East, to break it up, to have incursions across the borders, which would enable the Israeli nation to expand. Then, of course, we had in 1995 the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin by Israelis in their own country, because he was making great successes towards a possible peace settlement. So I think it's pretty clear what's going on is, the United States particularly are working with the Israelis in order to expand. Now, this, of course, is not going to come as very good news to the surrounding countries. In fact, for many of them, they've been preparing, like Lebanon has, for war pretty much, well, for a long time, but certainly since 2006, where there was an enormous Israeli incursion. So the Lebanese, although they've performed miracles, really, because they've got this horrific economic crisis, and yet they've realized, look, our entire integrity as a country is likely to, as a nation, is likely to be attacked by the Israelis. So I think this guy, Martin Griffiths, who's about to retire from the United Nations, has been doing a terrific job. Thankfully, he's a Brit who's, not someone like Boris Johnson going around making war. He's been doing a very good job making peace. And it's a shame to see him go. But isn't it interesting? He's used one of his last speeches to use this word apocalyptic. A lot of people are using this expression. I actually call it Armageddonism, The idea is to create such a massive conflict in the Middle East that everyone will be involved in it, and that the bad guys, that's the United States and Israel, believe that they can control the outcome. So this is the big fear, and this is what countries all over the Arab world are now preparing for.
And thanks, Tony. I'm glad you mentioned the word apocalyptic, because I wanted to put that question to Yves Engler. Thanks for your patience, Yves, and welcome to the program. Martin Griffiths, employing the word apocalyptic, do you think it's an exaggeration to say this thing could blow up into something potentially apocalyptic, or do you think he's right on cue?
I mean, I think it's good to warn that, because it could lead to something very damaging. I'm still a little bit skeptical of whether Israel is, the people running the Israeli military are that reckless to start a full-fledged war with Hezbollah, because I think they understand, as Hezbollah has demonstrated with, releasing of drone footage of different sensitive sites within Israel in recent days, that Hezbollah has the capacity to inflict real damage on Israel. And I don't mean just in terms of, Israeli soldiers crossing the border and, killing Israeli soldiers or blowing up Israeli tanks, but I mean really blowing up sites all across the country that are, deep within Israel, far from the border. So I think that the Israeli military command is sufficiently sober to not go that far. And I think that the Americans probably understand that Israel can, of course, as they've been threatening, turn Beirut into Gaza. But that would mean that large swaths of Israeli, parts of the country would also be seriously damaged. And Israel, after what happened October 7th, after their failures to wipe out the resistance in Gaza, suffering a military defeat in a fight with Hezbollah, which is a realistic possibility, that would go some way in undercutting the so-called Israeli deterrence of, the big power in the Middle East and stuff like that. So I don't know. I mean, I think that it could turn into something apocalyptic. It could be wildly damaging for Lebanon and significantly damaging for Israel, and also could spread in terms of, obviously there's other resistance groups in the region have already said they will target American facilities if Israel launches this major ground invasion. But I'm hoping, of course, that it doesn't go that way.
Thanks, Yves. And Tony, I want you to elaborate on what Yves just said with respect to decision makers in Tel Aviv being extremely reckless at this point. The U.S. has even told on a couple of occasions now that it fears the Iron Dome missile system, anti-missile system, will be overwhelmed if there is a confrontation with Lebanon and Hezbollah and whatnot, and that Israel will take some heavy blows to itself. And to think all this could have been prevented, Tony, if Israel would have accepted the ceasefire. I mean, it's almost like this cabinet wants it, as reckless as it may be.
No, I think they do. And but the thing is, I don't think the real decisions are being made in Tel Aviv. Actually, what you've got is people have a survival instinct within the Israeli military. They realise there's only so far they can go. But we have a similar problem over in Ukraine, where some of the protagonists don't suffer directly because they're thousands of miles away. So the United States is actually egging on, I believe, despite what people like Blinken and Biden say in public, egging on the Israelis. And the same sort of thing is going on over in I mean, for example, when Boris Johnson went over to Ukraine and said, "Don't worry, you can just keep fighting the Russians. We are going to back you." And so a lot of these decisions I don't think are necessarily being made in Tel Aviv. The Americans are actually looking for a fight, as they did illegally with Tony Blair and George Bush in Iraq. And that may be what's going on here. I mean, we have, I think, to rely on people like Martin Griffiths at the UN, which is a sad thing to say because they've got very little teeth, but at least they're speaking out, even though it's being very little reported in this part of the world, and making it clear that there has to be some kind of respite for Gaza. At the end of the day, what's going on here is a provocation, a massive provocation in Gaza. The Israelis and the United States want to draw these Arab countries particularly, but all countries in the Middle East, into a wider war. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, but their arms companies will make a lot of money, and they believe, as I said, they believe that with a conflict like this, they can control the geopolitical outcome, and they can gain from it geopolitically. They can gain territory. I don't believe myself. I don't believe they can, but they're managing to convince themselves of that. So I think they are prepared to take Hezbollah on, and they want to. You know, this is the mentality of a dying empire, an empire that's completely failing to compete economically around the world, and this is the only thing they can do is to kill and make money if they can from it.
And if I can, I want to put the same question to you, Yves. I feel like it could be, I feel like this one question could really take up the whole show's time. But why wouldn't Israel accept a ceasefire? It would get its captives back. It's already killed, I mean, you know, what, 37,000 people, 72% of them women and children. It's ruined the little, if any, standing it had left in the world, something it can't really ever pretty much, as far as face goes, make up. I don't know. It could stop the Hezbollah attacks overnight. It could stop the Yemeni attacks over the night, be done with the guns and the rockets, and it could all be over if it just withdraws, gets its captives back, stops shelling and bombarding Gaza, and accepts a ceasefire. But it's willing to, what, expand this thing to Lebanon and suffer more casualties. I mean, can Israel, what is it? It wants to protract this thing until it gets some kind of win? Or what do you think its ultimate objective is here?
Well, like I've said many times before, I think Israel's objective was to ethnically cleanse Gaza. And I think they have been unsuccessful in that. That's just not politically viable. And they also, of course, said they're going to wipe out Hamas. And now even Netanyahu's chief advisors are admitting that's not going to happen, as well as Israeli military officials. But I think that, you know, from the standpoint of Smoldrich and the other Ben Gvir, the real fanatic elements, I mean, they are using this to expand settlement construction in the West Bank. Some of them want to actually, you know, set up settlements in Gaza, as crazy as that may sound. And Netanyahu said no to that. There's also a segment of the Israeli far right that wants to actually settle in Lebanon. I mean, there's a whole movement. I don't think it's a big movement in Israel at this point, but you know, is talking about that, about pushing further into Lebanon, and you know, they're taking Lebanese territory and settling there. So that's kind of floating around in the background. Then you, of course, have Netanyahu's personal self-interest and preservation and just continuing fighting for his own political survival. And then I mean, I think that the Israeli military, you know, they were you know, troubled by what happened October 7th, and they were bested by Hamas. And that's embarrassing, and they respond by as much violence as possible. I totally agree with you that if you look at it rationally from the standpoint of avoiding war, avoiding more killing, and getting their hostages back, and even a certain degree of stability within Israel proper, but clearly the Zionist movement has been, you know, exceedingly violent its whole existence. And exceedingly expansionist. So the ability to sort of like restrain itself is not exactly a tendency of Zionism. And so long, you know, the Americans giving up and others, so long as those continue, you know, the fanatics within the Zionist movement are, you know, just going to continue pushing in the way they push, which is more violence and more expansionism.
All right, gentlemen, thank you both for joining us in the program. Tony Gosling out of Bristol and Yves Engler, they're joining us from Montreal. It's always a pleasure to hang out and chat with both of you guys. But let's see how this thing plays out, because this could really send the whole region up in smoke here in West Asia, from the Mediterranean to God knows where. Anyway, goodbye to both of you, and for our viewers, thanks for joining us for another segment of your Press TV News Review program. Stay safe, and bye-bye for now.